Now, you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between this and the overhated list? Well, the difference is that overhated episodes are episodes that get too much hate, whereas underrated episodes are just ones that aren't liked enough, with hate not necessarily being a condition for their inclusion. With that said, the algae's always greener. You're probably shocked to see an episode from the first 3 seasons on here, but after giving it some thought, this episode is really funny enough to compete with the fan favorites from the first 3 seasons. In addition to having a creative plot, we get gems of jokes like Plankton's universe warp stopping so he can drink a soda, holographic meatloaf, Krabs being naked, and just overall a lot of Plankton's reactions to things Krabs has to deal with. This episode is surprisingly meta for being so early in the series, and just in general for the time it came out, and I don't really see it get listed as people's favorites like Pizza Delivery or Band Geeks. It's also the very first episode of Season 3, and it starts the season off strong, possibly being the best season opener of the entire show, only rivaled by Friend or Foe. But that doesn't mean it's the last season opener on this list. It's no secret that Spongebob has had a problem with making 22-minute episodes good, for various reasons. This has been true even in the early seasons, with Christmas Who probably being the only really good one from back then. I mean, think of some of the worst episodes of SpongeBob. Chances are, a handful of the episodes you just thought of were 22 minutes or longer. But when they get it right, they really do get it right, and a good example of that is Goodbye Krabby Patty. A lot of times, what goes wrong with episodes like this is that Nickelodeon will hype up an episode in the promos, and give an expectation they can't possibly deliver on. Usually, this comes in the form of teasing some kind of change to the show. The weird thing about Goodbye Krabby Patty is that it managed to be good in spite of doing this. Where the other episodes failed in that regard is that obviously no major changes would be made to the SpongeBob formula, but instead just using that as an excuse to have nothing happen. They actually tried with Goodbye Krabby Patty, though. The story here really keeps you emotionally invested in the rift between Patrick and SpongeBob, and they do just enough to keep it from being a rehash of Selling Out. But there are also enough jokes to keep you engaged in the episode, so it still feels like a SpongeBob episode. Even though I like Have You Seen This Snail, that was a problem some people had with it. But the real reason I put this episode on an underrated episodes list is that I don't see this episode get talked about much. I haven't really seen anyone talk about this episode since it came out, which was over 7 years ago. And it's also telling about Season 9 in general. It has possibly the worst double-length episode in the entire show, and it has one of the best. And they came out years apart. The way I like to illustrate how long Season 9 lasted is to put it this way. I was in elementary school when it first aired, and it wasn't until I was in high school that it finally ended. You watch enough of this show, you see the entire range of emotions. You can laugh, have your heartstrings tugged, and there's enough bad episodes that this show can sometimes make you angry. One thing you rarely see SpongeBob do is drama, and you know what? If Enemy in Law is any indication, it shows that SpongeBob is a versatile enough show that it can do any kind of story it wants. Season 4 in general had a more dramatic tone, especially in the first half. There's this episode, the aforementioned Have You Seen This Snail, Krabs vs. Plankton, and maybe an example of a bad dramatic episode is All That Glitters. But when I see discussions of what the best Season 4 episode is, Enemy in Law often gets left out, which I don't really understand. Obviously it's no Krusty Towers in the comedy department, but I don't really think it has to be. The tension in this episode between Plankton and Krabs is unrivaled by pretty much all the other episodes featuring them, which I don't think is easy to pull off, especially since they've had almost 2 decades to do so. A lot of people write this episode off for the lack of super hilarious moments, but don't count this episode out. It's legitimately one of the best of Season 4. To the kind of person in my comments that always tells me how everything after the first 3 seasons is trash, I have one question. How do you explain Fear of a Krabby Patty? It's not terribly different from what you'd see in the first 3 seasons, but yet I still see people act as if the second this episode aired, SpongeBob became a bad show, which I think is a bit exaggerated. This story still feels like a classic story with the wacky elements you see in pretty much every SpongeBob episode. Plankton impersonating a psychiatrist ties the jokes of the episode together nicely as well. The obvious asset this episode has is its art style, which I dare say is the most distinct art style the show has ever had. It's only in this one episode, which can't be said of the stop motion, which appeared in 2 episodes. Most people see this episode as an alright episode in Season 4 and not much more, but in my opinion, it is one of the best episodes of that season. Being the first episode after the movie gave this episode a unique position and impossible expectations to reach. But in a vacuum, this episode is better than most of the episodes in the entirety of Spongebob. If there was ever a season where the good episodes don't get enough recognition, it's Season 8. This is because Season 8 does have some of the show's worst episodes, like Pet Sitter Pat and Free Samples. But when the episodes in this season were good, they did reach some high highs in my opinion. Drive-Thru, in my opinion, is the most underrated episode of SpongeBob, with no exceptions. A lot of people write it off because it's essentially a vignette of the new Krusty Krab drive-thru through a lot of characters' perspectives. Now, it's not the first time the Krusty Krab has had a drive-thru, since they did put one in Driven to Tears, and they also had to change the design of the Krusty Krab to make this plot work, which I do know rubs some people the wrong way and caused them to not like the episode, which is understandable. But to me, seeing these characters' perspectives of this new drive-thru gives a lot of potential for jokes. I mean, Bikini Bottom is essentially in gridlock because everyone is in line to get their food. Plankton gets run over, which is probably the best joke in the episode, and everyone just gets a shining moment in this episode, even if that means there's not a centralized story. And so, I really like this episode, even if other people don't.